Excuse me, Teddy, do you think that maybe every once in a while, maybe you could fill the gas in the car in the snow? I mean, you were the last one to drive. Now I've got to go stand in the cold and pump gas. Oh, okay. Well, duly noted. Why, hello there, endurance nerds. I report to you live from the snow capital of the United States to bring you the brand of science and sass to which you become accustomed on this channel. Hit that there like button if you like sass. I mean, it has the word ass in it, so it has to be good, right? But let's talk training, shall we? Winter. It's cold, it's dark, and if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, it feels like it's never going to end. Ever. And if you're like me, you might just be looking at your indoor trainer or treadmill like it just stole your wallet and wondering if braving the elements is worth it just to break the monotony of those masochistic indoor training sessions. But cold weather training, not just in winter, but in fall, spring, or that random Wednesday, isn't just about toughing it out. If you don't understand how cold affects your body, metabolism, and performance, you're not just making it harder for yourself, you could actually be sabotaging your training. So in this video, we're going to break it all down. What happens to muscle function in the cold, fueling considerations, how your breathing is impacted, and how to properly prepare for cold weather training to optimize performance. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to train smarter in colder months, avoid common mistakes, and maybe even use the cold to your advantage. So let's start by talking about muscles and why training when the temperatures drop below t-shirt weather can have you feeling more fatigued than usual. At a fundamental level, muscles contract through the interactions between actin and myosin filaments. Picture them like tiny hooks pulling against each other to create movement. But here's where it gets interesting. It actually requires more energy to get the muscle to relax than it does to contract. Now, this might sound counterintuitive because we think of the contraction as the work phase, but in reality, myosin heads naturally bind to actin by default. It takes ATP, your body's energy currency, to actively break those bonds and allow the muscle to relax. When ATP is limited, like in the cold, the muscles remain locked in a contracted state. Or, after death, below rigor mortis. So why does this matter in cold weather training? And it comes down to a concept called the Q10 effect. All chemical reactions in the body, including those that produce ATP, are temperature dependent. The Q10 effect states that for every 10 degrees Celsius drop in temperature, enzyme activity slows down by about 50%. This means critical biological functions are half as effective in the winter as they are in the summer, and fall along the spectrum of diminished capacity for everything else in between. Muscle contractions become slower and weaker, muscle relaxation takes longer, increasing stiffness, and energy production becomes less efficient, requiring more oxygen and more ATP. The practical outcome is that every movement becomes harder, less powerful, and more fatiguing. Now imagine what's happening in endurance sports where hundreds of contractions per minute are required. If your quadriceps can't relax quickly enough between each pedal stroke, stride, or push-off, your body is forced to work against itself. The muscle stays partially contracted when it should be relaxing, leading to increased muscle strain and microdamage, higher energy demands for the same output, and faster onset of fatigue. It's like trying to pedal your bike while lightly squeezing the brakes at the same time. You're just wasting energy fighting internal resistance. Now let's layer in another issue, muscle recruitment. Cold muscles aren't just slower, they're also weaker. When muscles are chilled, they produce less force per contraction. The body compensates by recruiting more of those muscle fibers to maintain the same workload. Not so efficient, right? In one study, researchers found that when a limb was cooled by just a few degrees, participants had to activate more motor units to generate the same forces they would at normal temperature. And those fibers had to stay active for longer, meaning that more energy was spent just to maintain performance. Suffice it to say, training in the cold is much more metabolically expensive. You're going to burn through far more energy for the same effort and put more stress on your muscles, impacting performance and increasing recovery needs. But we'll talk more about metabolic impacts in a few minutes. Here's the sneaky part about all this. Your legs may not even feel cold. That's because your legs have a low density of thermoreceptors. Unlike your hands, face, and core, your legs aren't really great at detecting temperature changes. You might feel okay riding and running in shorts at around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but your muscles could still be operating significantly below their optimal temperature, limiting your performance. Elite endurance athletes are well aware of this. Take professional cyclists, for example. They follow strict leg covering protocols to guard against both the ambient cold and the additional cooling effect caused by high-speed airflow. They wear knee warmers below 65 degrees Fahrenheit and full leg warmers below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, it might seem like an absurd proposition. That's not that cold. But those at the elite level know the penalty for not protecting their muscles. This isn't just about comfort. It's about maintaining muscle function and preventing unnecessary fatigue. How you perceive your skin temperature is not in any way determinative of how your body is truly responding. And that's the critical point here. A common myth is that as long as your core stays warm, you're fine. However, research has indicated that skin temperature and not core temperature is the biggest driver of force production loss. Studies have shown that even when core temperature remains elevated, cooling the skin leads to an immediate drop in muscle force production. This means that even if you're working hard and sweating underneath layers, if your exposed limbs are cold, you're still losing power. Even more interesting is that while it's not at all surprising that your face, hands, and feet are particularly sensitive to cold exposure, studies have actually shown that even just having lower facial temperatures increases global energy demands because the body ramps up metabolic heat production. And as we all know, cold hands and feet impair circulation, reducing dexterity and delaying muscle response time. So yes, keeping your face and extremities covered isn't just about avoiding discomfort, it's about preserving energy efficiency. Now, before we move on, let's quickly address Embro creams. These are the spicy, tingly rubs that a lot of endurance athletes swear by in cold weather, thinking that they warm up their legs. Here's the reality. Embro doesn't actually heat your muscles. What's happening is a trick of the nervous system. Ingredients like capsaicin or menthol activate temperature-sensitive receptors in the skin, making you feel warm. But your muscle tissue underneath, it's still cold. Even worse, some Embro products might actually redirect blood flow away from the working muscles toward the skin, which can increase heat loss and make your legs more vulnerable to fatigue. So does it feel nice? Sure. Does it actually prevent cold-related muscle fatigue? Not even a little bit. If you like using it, go for it, but don't let it replace proper layering or warming up. Bottom line, if your muscles aren't staying warm, they aren't functioning efficiently. So let's take a second to talk about the obvious. Clothing. Your clothing strategy in cooler weather can make or break your session. Dress too lightly and you'll undermine your training by accumulating muscle damage. It's better to err on the side of overdressing. It's the difference between simple discomfort and actual damage. But here's the caveat. If you're training around freezing temperatures, sweat management matters. If you overheat and start sweating excessively, that moisture can quickly turn into a liability, accelerating heat loss and making you colder, especially if your workout includes hard efforts followed by recovery periods or a long descent after a climb. The best approach is layering. Start with a good base layer, moisture wicking, merino wool or synthetic but never cotton. Then your mid layer, insulating but breathable, usually fleece or thermal layers are best, and finish with a solid outer layer, windproof and water resistant but breathable. And like I said before, don't neglect your face and extremities. Your body is hardwired to protect your core first, meaning that when temperatures drop, blood flow to hands, feet, and ears is reduced. Less circulation means reduced dexterity, numb fingers and toes, and even frostbite risk. You can leverage hand or toe warmers, neoprene, or additional layers to ensure your extremities are well protected. Whether it's 50 degrees or 10 degrees, mix and match these layering strategies to ensure you're treating your muscles well. There's no shortage of clothing out there designed to provide warmth and minimize bulk. I know that sportswear and technical fabrics can get pretty expensive, so if budget is a concern, I'd look at brands like Decathlon, Innovate, Craft, or shop sales or clearance items to cover your needs without breaking the bank. And if the expense is still not an option, just keep it indoors. It's not worth the risk of damage to go out unprotected. But if the risk of muscle damage wasn't enough, let's talk about how the cold fundamentally impacts your metabolism. When your body is cold, not only does it burn more calories, it shifts how it burns fuel. There's a common belief that training in the cold means that you're going to burn through more carbohydrates because your body is working harder to stay warm. And while total energy demands absolutely increase, the way your body prioritizes fuel sources isn't quite that simple. What's really interesting is that the proportion of fat oxidation actually increases across all intensities. Studies show that even when you're working at high intensities, the body is using more fat as a fuel source than it would in warmer conditions. To understand this, let's first break down how your body normally fuels exercise. Under typical conditions at lower intensities, so before your first lactate threshold, that's around zones 1 and 2 in something like a Coggin model, fat is the preferred fuel because it is more efficient for those longer sustained efforts. At moderate intensities, so between your first and second lactate thresholds, or zone 3 and 4, your body relies on a blend of fat and carbohydrates, ensuring enough energy is present to meet the demands of your muscles. And at high intensities beyond LT2, so zone 5 and beyond, carbohydrate oxidation dominates because glucose provides ATP much faster and fat oxidation just takes too long. But when the temperature drops, that balance or ratio will shift. And there are a few key reasons why. First, cold exposure triggers a greater release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, the same fight or flight hormones that increase fat mobilization. These catecholamines stimulate lipolysis, meaning that more fatty acids are pulled into the bloodstream to be used for fuel. Now, in theory, you might assume that more adrenaline, or epinephrine, would also mean higher carbohydrate oxidation. And while that is generally true, that's not exactly how it plays out in colder conditions. Cold exposure necessitates that the body reprioritize how it uses fuel. While adrenaline normally stimulates glycogen breakdown and glucose uptake, cold-induced peripheral vasoconstriction impairs glucose delivery in the muscles. In plain terms, when it's cold, your body redirects blood towards your core to maintain internal temperature, which means loss of blood to the working muscles, slowing down glucose uptake, less efficient carbohydrate metabolism, so that process of glycolysis, the breakdown of glucose into ATP, doesn't happen as quickly as usual. And because glucose can't be delivered as fast, your body compensates by burning more intramuscular fat stores instead. This is especially relevant for higher intensity efforts where carbohydrate oxidation is a dominant energy pathway. If glucose delivery is even slightly impaired due to reduced blood flow, it can create an energy lag, meaning that your body may struggle to meet sudden bursts of demand. And that leads to the crucial takeaway. Slower glycolysis in the cold can negatively impact high-intensity performance. Now, in case I didn't make it clear, I'm not saying that fat becomes the primary fuel source at intensity, just that it comprises a bigger piece of the energy pie. Carbohydrates still provide the fastest energy source, but in cold conditions, the processes that break down glycogen into usable ATP are slightly blunted. I already mentioned that cold temperatures slow down enzymatic activity, and that includes enzymes responsible for glycolysis. So even if glycogen is available, it may not be oxidized at the same rate. This means you may experience a drop in peak power output, particularly in threshold VO2 max or sprint efforts. Even though carbs still dominate the high-intensity work, their efficiency is reduced, leading to greater relative reliance on the slower oxidizing fat, limiting your potential performance. This doesn't mean endurance athletes should suddenly go full keto for winter training. Carbohydrates still play a critical role, but it does mean that fueling strategy and glycogen availability become even more important when training in cold temperatures. And it might feel like I just gave you an impossible equation to solve. If my body naturally shifts towards burning more fat, how the hell should I adjust my fueling in the winter? And there are a number of strategies you can employ without having to break out your TI-83. First and most obvious, increase your overall caloric intake. But recognize the fat shift. Total energy expenditure is higher in the cold, meaning that you need to eat more calories overall to maintain performance. But because fat oxidation increases relative to carbohydrate oxidation, you don't need to increase the carbohydrate intake at the same rate that you might for higher energy workout in warmer conditions. The body's metabolic shift means that fat is covering more of that increased demand than usual. Blindly increasing carbohydrate intake to match the higher caloric burn is not necessarily effective. The body's impaired ability to activate and oxidize carbohydrates quickly in the cold means that excess carb consumption won't necessarily translate into more usable energy on the spot. Instead, those extra carbs may either be stored as glycogen for later use, which isn't necessarily bad but doesn't directly solve the performance issue I just mentioned and does have an upper limit, or contribute to increased lactate accumulation, and that's not so great. Since the body struggles to metabolize carbs efficiently in cold conditions, if you try to force more carbs into your system in the cold, something that's increasingly experimented with under normal conditions, you might actually be increasing lactate buildup rather than fueling yourself more effectively. Because of the slowed enzymatic activity, instead of pyruvate entering the mitochondria for energy production, it accumulates, and the excess gets converted into lactate, giving you less headroom to produce and buffer lactate during your actual efforts. And that accelerates the buildup of those pesky hydrogen ions, or what we commonly refer to as lactic acid burn. This doesn't mean you need to start slamming bacon and butter before your workouts, but it does mean recognizing that your body will naturally pull from fat more than usual, and slamming 120 grams of carbs per hour is likely to do more harm than good. And you're probably thinking, this is all pretty nebulous. How do you take these insights and make them actionable from a fueling strategy perspective? And some small shifts can go a really long way. First off, ensure that you're preloading with carbs, especially for any appreciable intensity. Glycogen usage can potentially outpace glucose in the cold as it's stored locally in the muscles. In the warm weather, your body doesn't want to deplete those reserves, but in the cold, slowed glucose uptake has the body searching for any additional pathways to produce ATP. So making sure that those stores are topped up can go a long way for cold weather performance. And if you find yourself shivering, that energy demand skyrockets. Shivering isn't just an inconvenience, it's your body's emergency heat generator, using rapid involuntary muscle contractions to create warmth. This process can increase your metabolic rate by 2 to 5 times resting levels, pulling heavily from carbohydrate stores. If you're shivering before or during exercise, you're burning through glycogen at an accelerated rate before you even start pushing those high intensities. So not only will you need to load up those glycogen stores, you need to warm up properly. Too many of us get out for that workout and shortchange the warm up. This can be even more tempting in the cold as higher intensity increases core body temperature faster, right? But a structured longer warm up properly brings your aerobic system online, gradually increasing blood flow to the muscles, helping restore carbohydrate oxidation efficiency before you hit higher intensities. Think of it like priming your fuel system. If you just jump straight into hard efforts, your body is going to lean on fat more than you want it to, and you may feel sluggish or underpowered. And lastly, maintain steady fueling instead of waiting until you're depleted. In warm weather, you can get away with a more reactive fueling strategy, waiting until you've been working hard, or even feeling the early signs of bunk before taking in carbs. But in cold weather, that approach can leave you underfueled before your body even signals there's a problem. A good rule of thumb is to start with your usual carb intake based on intensity, say 60 grams of carbs per hour for moderate intensity efforts. Then adjust for the increased energy demands of the cold. For example, in freezing temperatures, caloric burn could rise by 20 to 40%. To balance this, your carb intake should scale up by about half that percentage. So, using that example, if your total calorie needs increase by 30%, you'd bump up your carb intake by 15%, bringing that 60 grams per hour up to about 70 grams. This small adjustment helps keep energy levels stable and ensures you're fueling efficiently without overloading on carbs that your body may struggle to metabolize in the cold. Individual needs are definitely going to vary, and this will require a little bit of experimentation, but the simple 50% carbohydrate rule is a good place to start. But what about the rest? While your body is burning more fat in the cold, eating more fat during training isn't necessarily the solution. Since digestion slows down and fat takes longer to convert into usable energy, while redirecting that critical energy and heat to the process of digestion, you should instead consider adding a small amount of protein, about 5 to 10 grams per hour to support your muscle function and to round out your calories. Just be sure to avoid any heavy or fiber-rich foods that are harder to digest and will pull energy away from your performance. Keeping fueling simple and easily digestible will help to ensure that you're using the energy where it matters. This might seem like a lot, but if you can get your fueling right, you can maximize your cold weather training and even turn it into an advantage. Repeated, careful cold exposure and proper fueling strategies can help to train the body to utilize fat more efficiently over time, which may offer long-term endurance benefits through metabolic flexibility. Attention to detail is really the key here. But let's shift gears again and talk about the ever-critical respiratory system. Have you ever stepped outside in a frigid morning and felt like your lungs were on fire? That's because the cold air is incredibly dry, and your airways aren't built to handle it. And that dry air dries out your entire respiratory tract. Unlike the humid air inside your lungs, cold air holds very little moisture. When you breathe in, your body rapidly works to warm and humidify it before it reaches the delicate tissues of your lungs. But in the process, your airway lining loses moisture, which can cause irritation, inflammation, and even a persistent cough, especially after those hard efforts. And even then, your lungs aren't fully protected. Cold air can exacerbate or even cause exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, reducing airflow by up to 50%. For some, this can start happening in as little as 5 to 10 minutes of exposure, especially in dry conditions. If you've ever felt like your breathing was restricted after a short warm-up in freezing temperatures, this is likely why. While it's most severe with those with asthma, even people without respiratory conditions can experience this. The muscles around your airways tighten in response to the cold, dry air, which restricts airflow and makes each breath feel more labored. You might not be out of shape, but you can sure as shit feel like it in cold weather. Your lungs are working harder to get the same amount of oxygen. Your perceived exertion also increases, even if your effort stays the same. Less efficient oxygen exchange means that your body has to compensate, increasing ventilation rate. This can make moderate intensity work feel like high intensity training and reduce your ability to sustain your efforts. And as you can imagine, cold air increases heat and fluid loss through respiration. As I mentioned, every breath that you take is warming and humidifying the air before you exhale it. In the cold weather, this means that you're losing more body heat and fluid just through breathing. That's a key reason why winter training can feel so much more exhausting, even if your intensity stays the same. So how can you reduce respiratory strain in the cold? Start with wearing a buffer mask to help to warm and humidify the air before it enters your lungs. This can offset some of the irritation. This is especially helpful in sub-freezing conditions where airway constriction becomes a lot more pronounced. Next, hydration is going to matter far more than you think. Since you lose moisture through respiration, staying well hydrated before and during training can help prevent airway irritation and maintain better breathing efficiency. And if you're training in extremely cold conditions, below 20 degrees Fahrenheit or so, you may need to shorten your high-intensity efforts. I think you guys get the point. The biological impacts are no joke, but we sure as shit don't want to be locked indoors every time the weather dips below a balmy 68 degrees. And in that regard, it's important to note that not all endurance sports are impacted equally by the cold. Depending on how much wind exposure, heat generation, and reliance on fine motor control your sport requires, you may have a tougher or easier time dealing with the colder conditions. If you're going to brave the elements, it's helpful to know how your specific activities are vulnerable, and maybe you can consider some cross-training to leverage the elements to your greatest advantage. Of all the endurance sports, running is arguably one of the most cold resistant. This is because running generates a lot of internal heat, and with warm blood moving to the limbs and extremities, resistance to the cold is significantly higher than in other sports, as long as you're maintaining the appropriate skin temperature with clothing. Running is slow enough compared to cycling or downhill skiing, for example, that the wind chill is minimal. The impact and muscle contractions create heat, keeping body temperature stable, and you can really layer up without worrying about those aerodynamics. But running is certainly not without its challenges. Footing can absolutely be treacherous. Snow, ice, and slush can be a real pain in the ass. Breathing can be even more difficult in frigid air, as running is a high ventilation sport, meaning that you take in a lot of cold, dry air, increasing airway irritation. And overheating can actually be a real issue. Many runners overdress, and once you start sweating, you're at risk of getting too cold when you slow down. Suffice it to say, your cycling or skiing loadout will be drastically different than running. And what about cycling? Cycling in the cold is a completely different beast compared to running, because you move much faster, which exaggerates wind chill, even at a moderate pace. A 30-degree day can feel like 15 degrees when you're moving at 20 miles per hour. Your legs generate heat, but your upper body stays mostly static, making core warmth a bigger challenge. Sweat management is harder, because wind strips heat away quickly, and sweat not properly wicked away from the body can make you dangerously cold. And hydration often gets neglected. Cold temperatures reduce those thirst signals, but you're still sweating underneath your layers. Add in the additional safety concerns that are ever present to us riders in those colder months, it makes removing handlebars much less appealing, and you can find yourself with very irritated airways. For cycling in the cold, it's best to just slow down. Use cross or gravel tires or even a fat bike to increase rolling resistance to scrub your speed, or simply ride routes that limit those speeds to control those conditions as much as you can. Of all the endurance sports, aside from maybe open water swimming, which I wouldn't recommend, cycling can be the most challenging to manage in cold weather, so do your due diligence. And that brings us to one of my personal favorite cross-training sports, cross-country skiing. Unlike cycling, cross-country skiing actually thrives in cold conditions. It's one of the few endurance sports where cold temperatures don't significantly impact performance. In fact, racing in slightly colder weather is often preferable. Skiing uses almost every major muscle group, generating a ton of internal heat that can be pushed to the limbs and extremities. Speeds are moderate, meaning that wind chill is less of an issue than in cycling, and often your trails are nested in areas where dense tree populations are going to further cut that wind. And while there's a strong aerobic component, breathing is slightly slower than something like running, making cold air irritation much more manageable. If you layer properly and protect your skin from the elements, cross-country skiing is probably the ideal sport to safely and productively train in the extreme cold, allowing you to break up the monotony of those winter months. Just keep the wax side down. I can go on, covering endurance sports ad nauseum, but I think you get the point. Considerations for each sport will change depending on the temperature and the elements, but the fundamental ideas remain the same. If you can dial in your clothing, fueling, and warm-up routine, cold weather training and cross-training can be effective, and even an advantage. But if you ignore how cold impacts performance, metabolism, and breathing, you're not building fitness. You're just setting yourself backward. But let me know, what's your go-to strategy for training in the cold? Do you keep it indoors? Do you bundle up and push through? Do you lean more on cross-training? Tell me in the comments below. And if you found this helpful, let me know if you'd be interested in a deep dive into heat training as well. And while you're meandering in that general vicinity down there, show those like and subscribe buttons some love. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.